Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, Finding Homes for Newcomers, Housing Solutions for People Fleeing the War in Ukraine. My name is Justyna Segerz-Frelek and I'm a Senior Policy Advisor at ICMPD's Policy Unit. Together with my dear colleague, Carlos Roldan Mejias, Social Policy Coordinator at Solidar, we will have a great pleasure to moderate today's discussion. As we know, the rapid arrival of almost 5 million people that have fled Ukraine and sought protection in the EU has created a range of housing challenges. In order to respond to the scale of arrivals, host countries have scaled up their capacity to accommodate this group in a variety of ways. This includes enlarging reception centers or repurposing existing buildings, including, for example, sports or exhibition halls. Many Europeans open their homes to Ukrainian refugees as well. A number of countries have been relying heavily on the generosity of private citizens, including the diaspora. It is true that many short-term initiatives have mushroomed, but some problems have arisen as well, mostly with regards to provision of safe and suitable private accommodation, addressing needs of vulnerable groups, and finally ensuring a smooth transition to longer-term solutions. These dynamics are also taking place in the context of substantial pre-existing housing problems in many EU member states, particularly in large cities, which often have insufficient social housing stock, lack affordable private housing, and see rising living costs. In today's webinar, we will look at different approaches to housing temporary protection beneficiaries from Ukraine. Our panelists will take a closer look at specific challenges faced by this group, and we will also discuss the potential as well as limitations of different housing efforts and look at how initiatives catering to the immediate housing needs can be embedded in long-term strategies. We have delighted to have a strong panel today who will share their respective views on housing newcomers from Ukraine from different angles. My colleague Carlos will now briefly introduce you to the SprINg project.
Thank you very much, Justyna, and thank you very much, everybody, for being in here with us today. We are really happy to have these discussions. But before we start the discussions, I would like to say a few words on the SprINg project, of the project under which this webinar takes place. So, like the full title of the project is Sustainable Practices of Integration, and it is funded under the EU's Horizon 2020 program. It aims to gather and summarize the best available research and evidence on integration and make it available to interested practitioners and researchers. Today's webinar is the last one of a series of discussions on specific issues related to integration and inclusion. We have been talking about education, entrepreneurship, labor market integration, and now it's going to be housing. So if you would like to follow the SprINg activities, we warmly invite you to become a member of the SprINg community. You can do so by registering to the project's Join Us campaign under the link we are going to post in the link, in the chat. I also have a short note of technicalities. So we invite you to post your questions whenever you want in the Q&A section. And if those questions are addressed to the speakers, if you have general questions to the organizers, please do so in the chat. But if not, if it's a question addressed to the speakers, do so whenever you want in the Q&A section. So we will collect them and we will try to answer most of them at the end of the webinar. Also, and you saw that we are registering this webinar, and it has like two main goals. First, for reporting purposes, and second, we are going to use this video also as a pedagogical material that we will upload together with the main takeaways in our platform in the upcoming weeks. So saying that, I look forward to these interesting discussions. So I'm going to give the floor now to my colleague, my wonderful colleague, Justina.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Let me introduce our first speaker today, Mr. Freek Spinnewijn, Director of European Federation of National Organizations Working with the Homeless, who kindly agreed to set the scene for our discussion today. Freek, Europe has seen an amazing mobilization, outpouring of aid from civil society, private sector, individuals. We saw various initiatives related to housing on local, national, and EU level. What's more, in July, the Safe Homes initiative was launched to further support the efforts in organizing housing for those in need. From your perspective, what are the main issues at stake when it comes to housing solutions for newcomers from Ukraine? And how do you assess situation today, 10 months after the Russian invasion? Please, the floor is yours.
Mute first. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is indeed Freek Spinnewijn. Maybe to just say I have been asked to set the scene, but I come from, of course, a very particular sector. So my point of view is not as general as you might want it, but I think it's probably still useful. Let me first say a few words as an introduction. The European Commission proposed the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive in March, if I'm not mistaken, and that was agreed upon by the Council. And I think that's a very good thing. I think we have to celebrate that, be thankful to the Council and the European Commission that they did that. And if I'm not mistaken, it was the first time that that Temporary Protection Directive was activated. It was, for instance, not activated during the Syrian refugee crisis. You can be cynical about that, why not, and why we do it for Ukrainians, but the fact that it has been done for Ukrainian refugees, I think, makes a huge difference. I think it's also useful to say a few words about the size of the refugee issue. I don't know if the latest data that I have are the latest data that are available, but it seems that there is more than 4 million Ukrainian refugees in the European Union area. Very unevenly distributed across the European Union member states. 3 million of the 4 million are living now in Poland, Germany, and the Czech Republic. So it gives you an idea where the problems that might arise are most acute. What is often forgotten at European level, I'll come back to that in a minute, is that the Temporary Protection Directive comes with a whole range of rights for the Ukrainian refugees. Also the right to accommodation. It's an enforceable right to accommodation. And after it was activated, we saw that providing accommodation was a priority for many of the receiving member states. And there was, like Justina said, impressive mobilization. And I think why that happened is obvious, is because everybody understands that for everybody it's clear that stable housing of quality is a key precondition to integrate in society and is absolutely vital for your quality of life. Now, even if at national and local level there was quite a bit of mobilization, I have to say that I was a bit disappointed, to say it in a euphemism, about the support of the European Union and the European Commission in particular. Justina, you mentioned the Safe Homes initiative, which is focused on housing and provision of housing or accommodation. But it was launched only in July, like the Temporary Protection Directive was triggered in March. And 4 or 5 months later, the Safe Homes initiative, which was already announced from the start, was actually launched. I think it's pretty late. But if you look at the content of the Safe Homes Initiative, it's reason to be quite disappointed. It's actually mere guidance. And the guidance is actually focused on how to mobilize and organize private hosting, mobilize private individuals to make space available in their houses or in their accommodation for Ukrainian refugees. And that's 6 months after the war. It's a bit late, you know, like most member states knew by then how to do it. So I'm not sure how useful the guidance is and how much it is used. There was a reference in the Safe Homes Initiative on funding, EU funding, but most of it is an encouragement to reallocate existing funding. So there's very little, not to say no new funding, EU funding for financing accommodation for Ukrainian refugees. So I'm quite impressed by the national and local mobilization in most countries, much less impressed by the support that the European Union is providing, especially on the issue of housing. And we're talking about housing here. Then 2 quick words about what is the current situation, the current housing situation. With the risk of being superficial, and there's only so much you can say in 10 minutes, but there is the hosting, the private hosting, like kind individuals that make, that open their houses of Ukrainian refugees. And I think as, like certainly in the beginning, that was the main intervention. But there is, of course, limits of such a solution. It's good for a short time. It's an emergency solution, but it's not sustainable. And we have already evidence that private hosts want to pull out, want to stop. It's more and more difficult to find new private hosts. And also, private hosting is not ideal. If you want to know, in our organization, when we define homelessness, we include people that are forced to stay with family and friends or other people because of lack of housing alternatives. You could consider that Ukrainian refugees in private hosts or accommodated private hosts are in that kind of situation. It's far from ideal. The other solution that is used is social housing. Social housing has been mobilized in quite a number of countries, but I think we have to understand that social housing was already overstretched and that there is a number of rules that make it complicated. Some countries have found ways to deal with the rules, but the rules in relation to local connection, the rules in relation to the time you have to be in the country before you have a right to social housing, etc., etc. So I'm not saying the social housing providers are not doing their best, but they're confronted with administrative and other limitations. Then there is a private rental market, and I think it's often the only real option at this moment. Like how long are we now after the war? Like at least, what is it, 9, 10 months. But you all know that private rental is expensive because dysfunctional housing markets, especially in big cities, Justina, you mentioned it. I think your chances to have adequate housing on the private rental market depends also very much on employment. People that are in employment, especially sustainable employment, will be able to afford better accommodation than people who are not. And the differences are huge. You discussed apparently this already, but if I compare my country with Belgium with Netherlands, you will see in Netherlands a large majority of Ukrainian refugees are at work. In Belgium, that's not the case. And so that impacts on their housing situation in the private rental sector, of course. And because the private rental sector is overstretched, it leads to situations of overcrowding, bad quality housing. There's no lack of unscrupulous landlords that see this as an opportunity. So there is, of course, part of Ukrainian refugees that are in bad accommodation in the private rental sector. And maybe also to say that in some smaller cities, the influx of Ukrainian refugees, especially in Poland, has been quite big, and it has actually had an impact on the local housing market as such, pushing up rental prices for everybody. So that's also something to take into account. And then the last thing that I want to mention is, in relation to the current situation, housing situation, is that there is some Ukrainian refugees becoming homeless or experiencing homelessness. I'm not saying it's massive. We only have anecdotal evidence, but it is happening also in countries with relatively low numbers of Ukrainian refugees, like my own country, Belgium. And when you want to avoid people becoming homeless or you address their homelessness, you often use very typical emergency solutions like hotels, gymnasiums, etc., which are, of course, not there for the long term. Now, Justina, you said that there is, of course, a pre-existing context in which all of that happens, and that's important to mention. The housing crisis is everywhere. I think in Europe, I don't think there is any country that says, well, we have our housing market in order, it functions and everybody is decently housed. If you know of one of these countries, please tell me, because I have not come across them. And of course, you see, because of that, all aspects of housing exclusion. Housing affordability is an issue, also for Ukrainian refugees, of course, because it's an issue for many, especially in the private rental market, especially for young people. Housing quality is an issue more in the east of Europe than in the west of Europe, but it seems to be an issue everywhere. It becomes even a bigger issue with now the climate transition and the energy crisis. I don't want to go into detail, but if your house is not energy efficient, it becomes even less affordable. Overcrowding is, of course, an issue. And all these issues are issues that are there, pre-exist the Ukrainian refugee crisis, and the Ukrainian people are confronted with that as well. Apart from that, there is a lack of social housing in most countries. There's also a lack of investment in social housing, so that doesn't make the situation better. There is also growing financialization of the housing market, investment in housing, money goes into housing as an investment rather than to provide actual housing. Maybe on that, I can say that the European Commission actually makes that worse in the framework of the banking union they're working on. I'm not going into detail, but it's just to describe you a situation, a housing situation that is extremely difficult. And so certainly if you have suddenly 4 million people entering in the country and trying to find a solution there. Maybe I would like to end my introductory remarks with one conclusion. I'm quite worried in general about the lack of respect on this topic for EU law and litigation. Can I just give an example? In a country like Belgium, for instance, I cite Belgium a few times because I feel comfortable talking about my own country. There is dozens of asylum seekers that are living on the street. Policymakers know that, and they don't do sufficient. There's not sufficient efforts to deal with that situation. Now, asylum seekers have an unenforceable right to housing, to accommodation. And that's just not respected. In Belgium, there have been 6,000 court cases, all won. And it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't seem to make a difference. There's still people forced to sleep on the street. Now, Ukrainians also have an enforceable right to housing. We already see that anecdotal evidence that Ukrainians become homeless. That's against the law. That's against EU law. That's against national law. And it seems not to matter, or not to sufficiently matter. And that's really an issue of concern to me. In previous contexts, I would probably call people to get involved in strategic litigation, but now I start wondering, does it actually matter if the judgments of the courts are not followed up? So it's a bit of a negative note to end on, but I think it's important to mention that. Thanks a lot.
Freek, thank you very much for this strong kickoff of our webinar. And now let's zoom in on the situation in the country hosting the largest number of temporary protection beneficiaries, namely Poland. I would like to welcome Ms. Katarzyna Przybylska, Head of Advocacy of Habitat for Humanity Poland. Katarzyna, I am from Warsaw myself, and what I'm hearing from my friends, from my family, is that there is no way to rent a proper flat in Warsaw anymore. And what we saw already in March, according to available estimates that might have changed in the meantime, was that, for example, in a population of Rzeszów, Polish city close to the Ukrainian border, at some point, population increased by more than 50%. In Warsaw by 15%. According to the same source, 2/3 of all Ukrainian citizens, including those who arrived before February 2022, live in the 12 largest metropolitan areas. And actually the displacement from Ukraine is not the only factor contributing to the housing pressure in the country. There are also many other reasons already mentioned by Freek. So from your perspective of your organization, what are the most pressing needs in terms of finding housing solutions, and what was your immediate response? And I'm curious how it evolved over time. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind invitation to join this webinar. And thank you, Freek, for presenting the overview, because right now I can only add some pieces from Poland to that, because it was very complex, and also reported Polish situation very good. So Habitat Poland operates in Poland for last 30 years. We are mostly focused on the fields of housing and housing exclusion. And housing challenges that are faced by people coming from Ukraine, but also by the host community in Poland, they didn't just appear this year. We've been facing the looming housing crisis in Poland for many years now. And the most pressing challenges, I would say, are housing affordability, the quality of housing stock, and looming energy crisis, and contributing towards energy poverty that we also face in Poland. So, and there is also almost non-existent segment of affordable housing. We have social housing with a very long line of people waiting, and private rental market and ownership. So this is the starting point to which people coming from Ukraine from late February this year, they were included in this puzzle or mixture of situation. So just to give you a very brief overview, going a bit more in depth to Polish housing situation, we have ownership as a dominating legal title. So over 70% of Poles own their homes and apartments. So the rental market is very stretched, and it used to be stretched even before February this year. It was reported that around 4% of the market was private rental. And also this year we are seeing rising inflation and difficult access to mortgages, bringing even more people also from Polish community to the rental market, because it's really difficult right now to get a mortgage and buy a home. And just to present you with some data, so this year we saw over 70% decline in number and 71% decline in value in comparison to 2021 on the mortgage market. So this brings us to the overstretched rental market, and as you mentioned, Justyna, rising prices of rents. So over last 5 years already, we've been seeing that. So rents in Gdańsk, for example, rose by 36%, by 47 and 48 respectively in Warsaw and Krakow, and in Łódź over 56% over last 5 years. And this year, with so much higher demand, the rents in Q3 in comparison to Q2 rose by 12% in Wrocław, 14 in Poznań, even 26 in Gdańsk, only during 1 quarter. And as you mentioned as well, giving the overview, the offer is very limited. So it's almost impossible to rent flat at this moment in the biggest cities in Poland. And we also should mention that new constructions in Poland are mostly on a private market, so either private developers or individuals building their own homes, and public housing stock only constitutes around 2% of the new construction. So social housing segment isn't growing, and as I mentioned, there's almost no affordable housing segment. And having all of that in mind, right now, we should discuss almost 1.5 million people from Ukraine who registered in Poland And according to studies by UNHCR, around 63% of refugees indicate they are willing to stay in their current host countries. So we may expect that this will build up to long-term situation, not only for this year or next year. So as mentioned, people coming from Ukraine to Poland, they were able to, they have access to housing and social services on the same rules that people in Poland have. So they can register for a municipal housing or social housing if they meet the criteria of every municipality they are staying with. But as I mentioned, the waiting list is very long, and we had at the end of 2021 almost 130,000 households waiting for municipal housing in Poland. So it means that it will take a few years at least to get municipal housing. That's why there is a big need to search another solutions. And where are people from Ukraine staying in Poland? As of September, 44% were staying on the rental market, 20% in hosted accommodation still, even though the financial subsidies mostly came to an end, and 13% in collective sites and 8% in reception centers. So we have approximately 800,000 people still in collective accommodation. And there are people who came there in March or April and are still staying in rooms or halls or magazines for 1,000 people staying in one place together. So this is one of the most pressing challenges, and there is no comprehensive strategy or plan to support those people in living collective accommodation and moving to other solutions, because basically there are no other solutions, especially in the biggest cities where people could move to. The other most important challenge is long-term and quality housing for the most vulnerable groups, like people with disabilities, older people, single mothers with many children. And those groups are facing significant difficulties in accessing more stable, durable housing solutions. And as it was mentioned, metropolitan areas are facing the biggest overcrowding right now and are particularly overwhelmed. And the data of May 2022 was that almost 70% of people from Ukraine stayed in 12 biggest cities in Poland. So this is why, for example, the newly appointed Minister of Integration is focusing on strengthening smaller cities and building capacity in smaller cities to make those cities more encouraging for people to move there too. And the idea behind this strategy that is being drafted right now is to combine three sectors: housing, education, and access to job market, because those are three pillars that are really crucial to support people in living independently in any city. So there is just one additional challenge that I would like to mention, and housing is like really difficult issue to solve. It's expensive, it takes a long time to construct new housing stock, and it always brings a lot of emotion and a lot of sometimes social tensions. So what we see in Poland is that majority of the solutions that are designed or discussed do not only focus on people coming from Ukraine, but are mostly on improving housing ecosystem in the country. And I feel that this is the first time in many years that housing became such an important and significant topic in Poland. And this is the moment when we cannot just omit this issue and say, okay, we will get back to this in 5 years or 10 years. We need to find some solutions right here and right now, solutions that will support people who came to Poland this year, but will be also useful for host community in the country to help everyone get access to decent place to live. So thank you for this part.
Thank you, Katarzyna. I do hope that despite the current challenges that the situation that Poland is facing now is also creates a window of opportunities for hopefully more fundamental changes in the future. Thank you very much. I would like to turn now to Ms. Petra Huek, Managing Director of International Catholic Migration Commission Europe, our project partner. Petra, the shared network, which was funded by ICMC Europe 10 years ago, promotes refugee inclusion partnerships in local communities across Europe. Your network members are engaged in housing initiatives for the newly arrived from Ukraine. Can you explain a bit these initiatives? What do they look like? What are the lessons learned? And I'm curious to what extent you also build on your previous work on housing.
Well, thank you very much, Justina, and we are delighted to be here, and thanks for the invitation. I think that this is a very interesting round of first presentations, and many things have been said, and I think it's good to see that we have already quite a number of important things that we all agree on. And I think what Katarzyna was saying just now, this is a unique moment in time that we realize that housing is a fundamental right that has not been ensured over the past 15 years, increasingly after liberalization, speculation, and that this is, I think, a unique moment in time where governments may want to look differently at this issue, and maybe like with Corona and other things, that it will really lead to a new awareness and dramatic policies, but we are very far from addressing these. You asked about the share network. Indeed, I will start a bit with the history. We have always looked very much at ensuring housing and placement for refugees coming overseas. So they would be coming to municipalities, and it would be planned arrivals by resettlement. So then we would try to work with our partners across Europe in making partnerships with municipalities, with NGOs and housing associations to get the housing in order, because housing, of course, is the first step in integration. Without sustainable housing, you cannot put your kids into school, you cannot go looking for work. So we had, of course, what I said, the situation that there is hardly, that there's limited social housing is already happening for a long time. So we have really looked a lot at how to increase the contacts and the intermediation between NGOs and how and with private landlords. Working on housing is very time consuming. And I think Freek already mentioned that it requires a lot of coordination, outreach, building of confidence, relationships, also financial engineering, because particularly migrants and refugees will not be able to pay their deposits. Many house owners are still very reluctant because they don't fear that the house will not be paid. So I think, I try to talk a little bit about practicalities. So that type of work, setting up housing cafes, doing all that outreach and engagement is very necessary for this group, because people come, they don't have the social contacts, they don't have the networks, uncles and aunts and others. So, and unfortunately, that type of activity has not been financed enough. What I wanted to say also, that of course, since, and Freek was already mentioning that, for Ukraine, there has been a lot of attention to private citizens initiatives. That already started since 2015. So the Safe Housing Initiative, I agree, it was quite late in the day when the Commission came with the Safe Housing Initiative. Also, we should, of course, recognize the subsidiarity issue of housing, which is a national competence. So in that respect, the Commission I will talk to some recent initiatives later. But this has been already being developed since 2015, also in the context of private and community sponsorships, where citizens then will take up even up to 2 years of housing, doing fundraising, and then also providing linked integration support. The Safe Home Initiative of the Commission indeed captures a number of these practices that have been developed, and the coordination that it requires, setting up portals matching refugees to adequate housing and communities. I really think that although that situation is not always ideal, there are many ways of making it work very properly. And we have seen that with Ukraine, more and more citizens have said yes, but also that the not really usual suspects that were looking at that as a distance and say these are left-wingers or church people that do this, but this has become much more mainstream. And we see indeed private business engaging much more and saying, okay, we still have vacant properties, we can reach out. So that is, I think, a very, very positive development. And it is also making that there are much closer relationship with the municipalities and these actors. So what we always say, all society approach, multi-stakeholder engagement, we see that happening because these people are otherwise in the street. So we will need, and I think in the second round you will ask a little bit more about longer term solutions. So I don't want to go too much into depths. I think we know that safeguarding of vulnerable groups is extremely important, and there are our partners on the ground are doing a lot of training, outreach. What does it mean, safeguarding the rights of refugees against sexual abuse, possible trafficking? What are the minimum standards? How do you maintain privacy? How do you make sure that a minimum of standards of living is being secured? But it also provides opportunities to link better to the labor market, because you make access to more networks within the neighborhood, within those that then can also find a way to better look for employment and other opportunities. So I see it really as a very positive development. Certainly because the structural housing problems and the lack of investments and the needs for refurbishment and all those things and responding to energy safety, etc., and not energy, but making them better prepared will still take a lot of time. So I fear that these solutions we will need in real time, while pressurizing for long-term solutions. But the longer-term housing solutions is happening a lot with pressure of these private citizens that now are hosting the Ukrainians and say, hey, listen, guys, we need that you meet your obligations. So it's becoming a new pressure group to the municipalities and the state to do something. And what Freek said, the lack of it's incredible that we have fundamental rights to housing, that you can go to court and nothing is happening. But this whole society engagement in seeing how dramatic the situation is looks and makes that other ways are being sought that I think otherwise would not have been addressed. So I don't want to talk longer. I'll come back in the second round with some other things. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for mentioning these soft measures, including outreach and engagement, because they are equally important for finding any solutions. Thank you again. Let me introduce Mr. Jan Laurier, Vice President of International Union of Tenants. Jan, so what we heard is that the majority or many people finds accommodation through private hosts. I read earlier today that the percentage share might reach even 50% in some countries. In Poland, 60% of temporary protection beneficiaries rent an apartment at their own expense. We discussed the skyrocketing rent prices in this situation. The future is really uncertain. So how do you see the current situation? What is your perspective as Vice President of Union of Tenants, those who are definitely on the weaker side? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me in this webinar. I'm Jan Laurier. I'm Vice President of the IUT for some years now, but I also have some experience as a deputy mayor in a middle-sized city in the west of the Netherlands. And I have a kind of déjà vu, because I was a deputy mayor in the 90s. And on that moment, there was another large crisis going on with the war on the Balkan states. Quite a lot of refugees were coming also to the Netherlands then. And one thing what was tried then was to help them with private hosting. For years as a deputy mayor, I was busy to get people out of the private hosting, because it gave quite a lot of problems. If it takes too long, it's not any solution. I agree with Freek on that point. On the other hand, in short-term times, you have sometimes need it because it's otherwise possible. And I think in that point, it's very important to get the people from Ukraine, but also the hosting families, very good information about each other. For instance, in the Netherlands, we have an organization who is trying to match them and give those information. I think that's a very important thing to get on with each other. And on the other hand, it has to be a temporary solution, because it can't be permanent. That's the first point I wanted to make. If you look at the situation now, I take the Netherlands as an example. I know the Netherlands, of course, the best. If the government is reporting to the parliament, they are counting in houses that are available for Ukrainian people. They aren't reporting in rooms that are available for Ukrainian people, but they are reporting in beds. So they are telling, well, we have now 80, 60, 70,000 beds ready. And that's the way of counting. And that makes it clear how serious the problem is and how the shortage is of enough dwellings. Freek spoke also about the crisis in housing in almost all the countries. Of course, there's also the possibility of social housing. Well, a lot of countries have just a few percent of social housing. The Netherlands has about 20% of social housing. But for instance, if I look in my own city, if you want to go to social housing, the waiting list is 10 years. So that cannot be a short-term solution. So you see that if there is the possibility to rent, it's always private rental situation. And then I think in that situation, also information is very important, because there are rules on rental situations. And when the scarcity is very large, you also see that people try to bend the rules. So then it's information, what are your rights as a tenant, are very important. So in the first question you asked, well, how important is information? I think information is important for people to know the rights, but also to keep on the rules that are part of the legal framework of housing, because otherwise it has the risk that it's crumble down. And the second question you asked was, is the awareness of house landlords, is it important to get housing? Well, if I look at the social landlords in most of the countries, they want to do something at the housing, but sometimes, like Frank also said, there are practical problems and there are rules who are difficult to change. So I think if social housing will be affordable in less dense areas in Europe, we have also have a look to the rules and make it possible for Ukrainian people to live there. Then a last remark, because what I see in the Netherlands worries me very much. You have the Ukrainian refugees, but there are also other refugees. And this summer, newcoming refugees from the other countries were forced to sleep in the street because there was no shelter for them in the Netherlands. So I really hope that it is not making a gap between different kinds of refugees. Of course, it is important housing the Ukrainian people, but it's also important housing the other people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, especially for pointing to the needs of other groups that are still arriving to the EU member states. Petra, I would like to return to you, since we will now focus on medium-term and long-term solutions. 10 months passed, the temporary protection will be automatically prolonged. We started winter season, so some observers state that we might expect increased arrivals, and what we see now is that many people might indeed want to stay longer in Europe, if not permanently. Mm-hmm. So what are the key issues necessary to developing sustainable solutions from your perspective? And you started discussing it a bit, and yeah, I would like to learn a bit more also regarding your community work, because these communities, they have to be ready for potentially large numbers of new arrivals, but they need to think about longer term solutions at the same time.
Yes, I'm really flattered that such big problems can be put for my comments and for all. We have a vision that we worked on since 2012, and which maybe not everyone will appreciate, but one of the longer term solutions we will have to find is have better placement policies for hosting refugees. What we have seen since the Syrian refugee situation, that there are countries like Germany with their famous Königsteiner Schlüssel that has mandatory policies for all territories to take their role in hosting refugees and giving them obligations to find housing solutions. Even that is complicated, of course, with the temporary protection directive. I know that the Germans have tried to steer with 1 million people coming to Germany. You cannot just have that everyone goes to the place to their first of liking, but we have been, and it will really require much more engagement for the longer term. We have been really looking a lot at diversifying to better distribution to smaller municipalities and rural territories. So that is something we have been working on for the last 10 years, which requires, of course, a lot of engagement of these communities. What is really what we have seen is that after 2015, there was a lot of engagement and a lot of new vision to say, okay, let's do this better, let's distribute better, let's build reception and integration capacities better. But then, of course, everyone thought, okay, this problem is gone away, we're going to dismantle all that had been built over that period. Many I know that integration services, housing that was available that could have easily been sustained. Again, there was no funding, so they had to stop and give it up again to other. So what we see with our also rural stakeholders, that there's a lot of wishes to work better in building their integration structures, to refurbish and remodel housing, making them energy efficient and offering longer term solutions. But it will need that we take a longer time look at this. We cannot just say we're going to do this for 1 year and then. So I know that there's a lot of things happening in the area of innovative financing, of new credits, offering new credits, of getting new ways of loans. But I think that this financial engineering and building capacities in those areas that until now have capacity should really be launched much more seriously. So we need really holistic policies. I was just receiving, I had a chat with the European Commission that were attending our rural conference last week at the Committee of the Regions, where we had a lot of mayors and territories coming together and discussing these issues and saying, oh, we really have a problem. Half of our housing is in the hands of people that have second homes, or they are really, they really need new, we really have to do something with them. And then what I found interesting, what they were just saying, and maybe Freek, you said the Commission is not doing anything, but maybe it's a good platform to share this very new news. So the Commission and the European Development Bank have launched an EU-level situational analysis on the needs and capacity of stakeholders involved in migrant housing and financing, which is indeed, I mean, we can say better late than never, but never waste a good crisis. So these initiatives are now happening, and there will also look at a further revision of the AMIF and the other funds. Look at financial blending, providing low-cost long-term loans with reduced collateral requirements, and indeed look at ways of financing also private property, which is super complicated. If you look at property rights, if you provide loans, what will happen with this housing? You are giving public money to private houses. Who will it then, if that then will increase in price, then again, we will have this speculation that people will. So these are very complex issues, but indeed, this is being addressed now, at least with some serious studies. And I heard that this market assessment report is expected in April, May, and the implementation option reports in July 2023. Of course, we have to stay skeptical, but I think it's very good that now that the water comes high, as we say in Dutch, we really are seriously looking at how to make use of different financial instruments, because that will be really key. I don't know whether this answers all your questions, Justine, because
I think we would be able to continue until the evening, but
I'm sure. I'm sure I forgot some things. Maybe one
there
of
will
my
be
colleagues is there that they can maybe add to some things.
Yeah, and there will be a possibility to add remaining issues at the end of our conversation. I'm sure about that. Thank you very much, especially for raising this funding issue, but also the redistribution, relocation issue that seems to be crucial, but it requires a lot of coordination, cooperation. I suppose it requires a lot in terms of awareness raising and communication to really also convince and encourage people to choose the place of their residence. Last but not least, let me introduce Mr. Alexander Wolfhard, Deputy Director of Migration Policy Group, another partner in the SprINg project, who will give us kind of an analytical perspective of the issue. Alex, MPG developed over 150 integration indicators as a part of the National Integration Evaluation Mechanism, including on housing. And together with partners, you've been monitoring integration policies in 15 EU member states, I think for 6 years. And in our joint project, SprINg, you dive deeper into the issue of transferability and replicability of integration practices. And based on these exercises, can you give us a brief overview on the key trends in the area of housing for refugees? And what are the chances of transferring lessons learned, practices from one country to another, from one region to another? Because integration experts often say that when it comes to transferability housing, practices are the most challenging. And yeah, if you could tell us why.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Yes, as you mentioned, we have conducted comparative research on integration policies for beneficiaries of international protection, including housing, with a regular monitoring taking place in 2017, 19, and 21. So that was, of course, before the invasion of Ukraine and the activation of temporary protection, and referred only to recognized refugees and persons under subsidiary protection. But I think it is still very, very interesting to look at these results because the research actually reveals how well or not so good countries were prepared to deal with the current crisis. As we look at the integration systems in place as a whole. And if you look at housing, the main result, I think, is that there is this huge gap between countries, huge differences among member states, especially among those countries that are receiving most of the refugees in the current situation. So what we have done is to compare housing integration indicators, 14 indicators at all, including, for example, provision of targeted housing support, especially in the early integration phase, transition phase, provision of mainstream housing support, what about equality in access to housing benefits when compared to nationals, provision of information on housing conditions, access to housing for vulnerable groups like unaccompanied minors, but also collaboration between national governments and local and regional governments and civil society organizations. And then the results of these indicators are turned into a scoring system between 0 and 100. And on average, what we see that the weakest score here is around 15. That is Greece, followed by Hungary then. And the strongest scoring country achieves 79 points, which is France, then followed by Sweden. So there's really a spread of 64 scoring points between the best and the worst performing countries. And that is really describing the gap that exists among the refugee housing policies among European countries. I mean, we had 14 countries, and they are quite a good sample for the EU as a whole. And if you look at the member states in East Central Europe receiving most refugees currently, they are all on the weaker side here. It's the Czech Republic that is, relatively speaking, scoring best here. We also looked into Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. And countries are especially weak when it comes to, mainstreaming refugee integration policies across different policy areas, not only housing, but also education, employment. They are weak in having national integration strategies that take into account the specific needs of displaced persons. They are weak on multi-level coordination and multi-stakeholder collaboration. And there are these pre-existing weaknesses in many countries that really come to the fore in the current situation, and which are kind of backfiring in the current situation due to the lack of investments and policies in the past. The question here was about the trends. If you look back to 2017, 2019, and 2021, actually in most countries, the policy frameworks are very stagnant. We have seen changes only or improvements in France, Lithuania, and Greece. And I think the big question now is, of course, what is happening after the large-scale arrivals and the activation of temporary protection. Is this now a moment in which countries are really improving the general integration frameworks as such? Is this actually an opportunity to build more comprehensive mainstream integration support systems? Or will governments cling to this notion that, temporary protection and refugees from Ukraine represent different type of displacement with completely different needs than, for example, arrivals from Syria or Afghanistan, and the governments then will continue to find solutions for people fleeing Ukraine, which are completely separate from the existing integration systems, which is actually what is happening in most countries. I think that the question remains open. It can go both ways. On the one hand, you would of course expect that countries, just the sheer size of the challenges will force countries to simply better adapt the systems to the specific needs of displaced people. Again, housing as much as education or health or employment support. Or on the other hand, if we look at the discourse in place in many countries, public discourse, but also government's discourse about refugees, illegal migration versus people arriving from Ukraine, you can really have your doubts whether this ambivalence that exists right now in many countries will be overcome. The second part of the question was about transferability of good integration practices in the housing area from country to country, how easily this can be done. I would say yes and no at the same time. Yes, because there is no reason why a government could not adopt policy benchmarks, which are quite obvious. For example, we have an indicator on criteria for allocating people to targeted accommodation, placement policies, if you want, including adequacy or standards of accommodation apartments, accessibility of key social services in the environment, affordability, security of tenure, availability of employment opportunities in the area, but then of course also taking into account the preferences of beneficiaries themselves. We see actually only in Sweden and in the Czech Republic systems in place that would foresee such criteria. And I think this is really easy to adapt for policymakers. It's conceptual, it's governments can build their targeted housing support policies around such indicators. However, on the other hand, and I think this is exactly what Peter, you mentioned before, if we look at the more concrete, small-scale level of integration practices, it's actually quite difficult because you have all these different legal systems, structures in place across countries. The housing markets function in a very different way. Renting versus ownership, the size and the accessibility of the public housing sector, etc. And we actually do not observe many cases of practices being transferred here from one country to the other. I think the best advice one can give to integration practitioners who are interested in following some international models here is really to check on whether the frame conditions are comparable, both with regard to the structure of the housing market and housing policies, but also concerning the composition of the refugee population, the beneficiaries, whether you have a similar profile. I think that is the most important thing for practitioners to take into account if they're interested in adapting a model.
Thank you very much, Alex. Let's now move to Poland again. Katarzyna, so from your perspective, Polish perspective, what does it take to move from immediate reception to medium or long-term housing solutions? And that's a bit my second sub-question actually is related to what Alex just mentioned, this practices from abroad. Are you testing anything that was implemented by your partners? Do you see any need or space for innovation in Poland?
Thank you very much for this question. And I would say that what it takes to transition from immediate reception to longer-term housing solutions is existence of longer-term housing solutions. And this is the biggest challenge that we are facing right now in Poland. There are some ideas or even draft legislation on people in collective centers that they will be supposed to pay some sort of contribution to running of the collective centers. And I feel that, well, we should not expect someone, and the reasoning behind that is to make people living in collective centers be more willing to leave centers and move to other housing solutions. But how they should do that if there are no other housing solutions available, especially if we are talking about the biggest cities where the collective centers are located and where, as we mentioned in the previous part of the webinar, there are just no available housing units and no housing offer that they could tap into. And this is one of the biggest concerns that we have, and the challenges that we are facing, that basically we need to build better housing ecosystem in the country facing the crisis like we are facing right now. And this is so difficult. And I'm really interested, Alexander, where Poland is on your index that you've mentioned. I have my some ideas where we can be, but I would love to hear the exact number that we scored. So yeah, and what we should, but basically what we should do to have those other solutions. Well, first of all, we would need to have more access to rental market, and it was mentioned by Frank on the chat. Social rental agencies model. This is one of the models that we as Habitat are testing in Poland for last few years. It was even passed into our Polish legislation last year that every city in Poland can start social rental agency. The model would be very useful right now because it helps to overcome some challenges faced by the refugees on the rental market, like discrimination or some doubts by the landlords on renting to the single mothers mostly, or just refugees. So having this intermediary social rental agency in the process could be one of the solutions. Another thing that we would need to do in Poland would be to have more affordable housing stock. And to do that, well, one idea would be to open up existing housing stock to the rental market. So let's say housing, holiday housing, second housing, investment housing that people just bought as a form of investment of capital, and it's just there but empty and no one uses that. So some legislation measures to encourage people to use this for the rental market, or maybe to sort of force people, like catastrophe, for example, or other forms of payments for unused housing stock could be considered. So the other idea would be also to renovate existing but empty housing stock, or just empty spaces like unused schools or facilities, and turn this into housing, having in mind the requirements to make this energy efficient. So we would build into two segments: affordable housing and more eco-friendly and energy efficient housing. But those are long-term solutions that we would start to implement right now to see the effects in the best cases in 6 months, but sometimes in 2 or 3 years. Also, we could think about having more public-private partnerships in housing sector, and using the potential of private developers to build together with municipalities or national government to just increase affordable housing stock in Poland. And well, when the crisis started, we in Habitat for Humanity Poland, from the very beginning, we saw that there is a need for sort of 3 steps: supporting people on the move, providing them with temporary shelters, bringing them together with solidarity housing, so hosted accommodation, hotel rooms, hostels rooms, and so on. Then midterm solutions, access to rental market, the social rental program that I mentioned, social rental agencies. And we observed that from early May that people coming from Ukraine and staying in collective shelters, they started looking for more durable housing solutions. And as I mentioned, we've been testing social rental agency model in Poland since 2017. And since the war started, we sort of transferred majority of our activities into supporting people coming from Ukraine. Right now, we have around 170 apartments rented in Warsaw and in the Silesia region that we rented from private landlords, and we provide them to the people from Ukraine who need access to more durable housing solutions. And then long-term solutions, what we are doing, we cooperate with local authorities and renovate unused vacant housing units owned by the cities. to bring them back into use and to increase affordable housing stock. And I feel that those activities, if we do them on scale, and as I mentioned, the Minister of Integration also considers those solutions, using social rental agencies, renovating empty spaces, just to increase affordable housing stock in the country, and especially focusing on smaller cities to support people in moving out from the biggest cities and providing them with offer in smaller cities that would be interesting and that would encourage someone to move to another city. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this three-step approach. I think it nicely summarizes our whole discussion today in terms of what is needed now and in the future. Jan, what would you add in this regards? What I mean is the creation of durable housing solutions for people from Ukraine.
Well, at first, there's an important lesson to be learned, that we were in a housing crisis, and the housing crisis is become more severe. Now there are also Ukrainian people there. Why did we come in a house crisis? That we thought very long, most countries thought very long, that the market would solve everything. And it isn't true. So we came in a crisis by that. So it's very necessary that the state and the local governments take initiatives to make enough stock for affordable housing. That's one. Second is you have to also have rules and laws that protect tenants. That's very important, because you see that the countries where there's that kind of protection are also the countries with the best housing stock. So that's a important lesson. But it's not only the point that we have to do on the moment here in our countries. There is also a great necessity to rebuild Ukraine after the war, because not all the people will stay and quite a lot of people want to return. So you have to make the possibility to get back if people want to go back. And I think that's are the points we have to do. And in that last point, Europe can have a very important role, I think.
Yes, thank you. I think in case of persons from Ukraine, the notion of return and return that is happening already now isn't it a case. Thank you. My final question before we go to questions and answers is for SprINg. I will allow myself to quote your last report on housing exclusion, where we read that housing markets remain severely unaffordable. The gap between real incomes and the cost of decent housing is widening, and homeless services are being overwhelmed. And what is more, non-standardized reception conditions combined with dysfunctional housing markets have made refugees and asylum seekers particularly vulnerable to homelessness. So what are the necessary steps towards durable solutions for this group from the perspective of homelessness service providers?
Yeah, I'll try to answer that, and I'll try to avoid repeating what other people already said. If you allow me, I would first like to make a sort of probably a superficial statement that it's something that frustrates me enormously. I'm now 25 years involved in European social policy, also migration policy, and I think that there is too little housing experts involved in these policies. It is as if those experts that are experts on poverty and on migration are not experts on housing, and therefore housing is not given the attention that it should get. I think we should do something about that. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is we have to consider homelessness as primarily a housing problem. If refugees are homeless for a long time, they will accumulate all kinds of problems by the simple fact of becoming homeless, but it doesn't make their problem less of a housing problem. And I think we have to avoid the tendency from some policymakers to do that. Homelessness is always, in every case, primarily a housing problem. Whether it concerns refugees or asylum seekers or other people, it is a housing problem. Then in terms of solutions, we already spoke about the need for more social housing, etc. I'll probably throw something in the debate that is a bit of a taboo. I think we have to see within the existing social housing stock, if we can better allocate or better allocate the social housing on the basis of the urgency of the housing need. Jan already mentioned that there's huge waiting lists, and in many countries your time on the waiting list is actually the primary selection criterion. Is there a way to let people jump the queue because of the urgency of their housing need? I think it's something, I know it's a complex issue, but I think we should reflect a little bit more about that. And then to just repeat what Katarzyna said, we have to be a bit more creative and courageous in the provision of affordable housing solutions. Social rental agencies as a means to socialize the private rental sector, certainly worth trying. Not all countries are doing that. We shouldn't overestimate the potential, but it certainly can fill gaps. Nobody mentioned the sort of new building techniques, that is cheap construction techniques. If you would have asked me 20 years ago, is container built a solution? I would say no, definitely not. Now, I don't know, like a prefab container, there is some potential there. Vacant housing, vacant building, like Katarzyna mentioned it, office space, like the many cities have lots of office space that is empty. There is probably something we can do with that. But also typically in big cities, the space above shops is empty. That could be used. It's all tiny things, but all the tiny things together can actually make a difference. New sort of legal structures, the community land trusts, also not like it will not solve the housing problem, but it can help. I cannot go into detail, but it's a promising way of creating more affordable housing, co-housing, all these kind of things. So I think my call is basically, let's be a little bit more creative and courageous and look beyond the standard response. But we still need, and I agree with what people said before, we need some kind of a new ambitious construction program in Europe. It was done in the after-war period, like huge construction happened. Like, why is there no debate about something like that, you know, and the role that the European Union can play in that? I think we should look at that. And the last thing I would say is back to the fact that the laws are not being respected anymore for everybody. What I think is we should use more infringement procedures at EU level for these cases. I find it quite unbearable that the European Commission is really outraged about what happens in Hungary and Poland in relation to the rule of law, etc. But when countries like Belgium or Netherlands leave hundreds of asylum seekers on the street, nobody reacts from the European Union. It's not worth to intervene, but that's also a rule of law issue, you know? It might not be Hungary and Poland, which are easy targets, but I think we should also look at that. Recently, the Commissioner Johansson was on a visit to Belgium. She probably have to pass homeless asylum seekers on her way to the ministry and still said no word about that. It's in the press every day in Belgium, and the European Commission doesn't take that as a rule of law issue. And very, very quickly, and the last thing, we should also not allow policymakers to dilute the accommodation rights that are enshrined in EU law for people benefiting from temporary protection, but also asylum seekers. We hear more and more that we'll focus on the most vulnerable amongst the asylum seekers. Children, pregnant women, etc. But that's not the law. The law says accommodation for all asylum seekers. Or we say we'll focus on the temperature. When it's cold, we'll take everybody in. But when it's not cold, we'll leave them out. No, that's not what the law says. Or arguments like we do our best, or we do the maximum, or other countries don't do their share. All of these arguments are not legal arguments. The law says you have to provide accommodation for asylum seekers and Ukrainian refugees. And that's not done in all of the countries. Sorry to end with a bit of a frustrated note.
No, still there were a lot of constructive recommendations from your side. Thank you. I will now give the moderation rights to Carlos, who gathered, I'm sure, a lot of interesting questions to all of you. Thank you very much.
Of course, and thank you very much. So interesting, like we have been discussing about so many things, like I think it's impossible just to have all the takeaways from these conversations, but we have several questions, and then I'm gonna share with you right now. And I'm gonna start, I'm gonna like copy the question and I'm gonna paste it in the chat. And that first question, I think is gonna be addressed probably to Katarzyna, but could be also someone else. And but I'm gonna start with that question just a moment. And basically, it's a question of gender, and it is what are the vulnerabilities of refugee women in the context of housing, and how can be addressed. I'm addressing that question to you, Katarzyna, but if some of you they want to also to answer that question, you're more than welcome.
Yeah, so according to the report by UNHCR that I shared the link with you all on the chat, over 70%, 85% of Ukrainians coming to Poland are women, and majority of them are traveling with family members, mostly children. And they are facing significant challenges on the rental market in Poland. But I would say that this is not because of the fact that they are refugees, but of the fact that they are women with children. And the same challenges are faced by Polish women. And this comes from the protection of tenants. So landlords are afraid of renting apartment to mothers, single mothers, because of very difficult eviction procedures. And even though we have in our legislation some provisions of law making this easier for landlords to evict single mothers, like there is, for example, this type of lease agreement called occasional lease. Under this agreement, the tenant agrees or declares that they have a different place that they can move to if they are evicted, and they agree to enforcement. So because of that, the landlord, if anything goes wrong and there are delays in payments, the landlord doesn't have to go to the court, and court proceedings in Poland take 2-3 years usually. So they don't have to do that, they can evict easier. And in the first special act on the support for people coming from Ukraine, our government make those provisions of law even more applicable to people coming from Ukraine, saying that people from Ukraine, they don't have to give address of another place that they can move to. They can just declare that they have other place and they could be evicted easier. So this should be sort of argument for the landlords to be more inclined to having lease contracts or occasional lease contracts with people from Ukraine, with single mothers from Ukraine coming to Poland. But still, this provision of law wasn't very much used. And we, for example, run this information line and providing access to information on housing to people from Ukraine, but also to Polish landlords. So we had a lot of calls about how to resolve the legal situation, what are the forms of legal contracts that they can sign. But still, a lot of refugees contacted us reporting that landlords, they just hang up when someone from Ukraine calls them, or when someone indicates that they are a single mother traveling to Poland with kids. So there are some significant challenges on the rental market. And this is the reason why, for example, the intermediary model like social rental agency or social rental programs are so much needed, because this allows to overcome this initial barrier. And right now, after a few months of running this program for Ukrainians, we see that after some time, this may be possible to just transfer the agreements to be signed between landlords and the tenants, because after a few months, when the tenants were paying, landlords see that, okay, everything is going fine. They found job, there aren't any problems. So they would be more willing to sign the agreements. And just one last comment from my side, this is also part of the fact that we have relatively young rental market in Poland. So this is developing since 1990s, and this is mostly like private persons rental market, so no institutional players, significant players in the market, but mostly one person having just one singular apartment rented on the private market. So we still need to professionalize a little bit our rental market, or make it just more understandable and easier for everyone to be members of this ecosystem.
Indeed, indeed. And I don't know if some of you would like to add something to that question, to that answer, sorry. And if not, I will go to another question. And that one could be, I mean, they didn't address the question to anyone, but I think that could be answered by Jan, for example. And but I'm gonna put that in here. The question it is, let me share the question just a moment. Often refugees revert to substandard housing solutions or concentrate in certain districts as they struggle to access adequate housing. What can be done to avoid such situations? And yeah, thank you, Tim.
Well, you see in some European countries, the placing of refugees is also not only is look at available houses, but there's also look at the labor market. So that's one way to have much more spread. That's one. The second one is we in the Netherlands are advocating that you not concentrate, for instance, social housing, but try to spread it over different neighborhoods. That makes it impossible that you get large concentrations of, for instance, poor people or refugees and things like that. And it's really a way of how are you planning your affordable stock. And I have to say that there's also another trend in the Netherlands. That is that you see that some bigger cities they say, well, we have too much poor people, so we want to close our borders for people who are too poor. But and I think that's a very bad thing going to do, because you mustn't close down, but you have to plan it in the front. That where are you going to build affordable rental stock?
Indeed, thank you very much. Now there's another question. Yeah, this one is not addressed to anyone, but I think it could be answered by whoever. And thank you all for your for the presentations and everything. as we think about longer-term solutions that also meet the housing needs of host communities members. Perhaps there's a role for more collaborative housing solutions that, for instance, go house refugees with longer resident students, senior single parents, etc. This might also have the benefit of supporting integration. Do you have any experiences with such initiatives that you could share? Petra, would you like to answer that question? Or Alexander, one of you?
Yeah, I think that indeed now with the community sponsorship and citizens hosting, there's a lot of attention to this type of matching, and there are examples that have been developed, but you have to really know your network quite well. There have been both in the Netherlands and in France, and maybe in other countries, but I'm not aware of these. For example, having been quite a lot of community outreach amongst older people to say, well, would you want to host either students, of course, other low-income groups, or refugees and migrants in bigger houses, and then they can also sort of do some work or stay sometimes in the evening, have a dinner together. And I think that it's all about social innovation, and how do you live together within your community, and how do you try to share in a different way the resources. These are happening, and I think it's important to share these type of practices, but not necessarily very easily scalable. It really would depend on how you engage with your community members. I think it's much easier in smaller places, because the social contexts are normally closer than in bigger cities. But again, you see that new actors are coming up and speaking up and say, well, I want to respond, I want to do something. Of course, most of the time, our NGOs that we work with within the SHARE network try to do that work, try to do outreach and public meetings and say, okay, how can we match these actors better? Again, it's time consuming. I don't see, so the role of intermediaries is in that respect is very important, because you have to bring it together with a plan. So all very resourceful, but indeed, I think that the housing is such an enormous issue for all low-income groups that we have to create platforms to find these solutions. And I think maybe social innovation labs, I don't know, it was Freek, he said, well, we don't have enough people from the private sector or people that are really housing experts. But we talk to them quite regularly, but they don't have a platform or a way to pilot or an innovation fund or to really try to launch these types of initiatives more widely. I don't know whether that answers your question, but things are happening.
Things are happening. Yeah.
Slowly.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Petra. And okay, now I've got another question, and I'm gonna copy paste it, and in this way you can see that. Just a moment. Okay. Okay. And that's gonna be probably the last question. And if you want, well, one of you, Alexander, Freek, if you want to answer that question. Housing is a very sensitive issue, as it is also directly connected with social cohesion questions. Do panelists have any experience to share to ensure that refugees receive adequate housing while not increasing negative perceptions on migration and towards refugees? Alexander?
Yeah, I mean, of course, very good and broad question. What comes to my mind here, and actually it connects to the previous question, is as an example the so-called Plan Einstein in Utrecht, which was a large-scale project initiative a few years ago, which was built on the idea that if you provide housing not only for refugees in an area, but also to other disadvantaged groups, like disadvantaged youth, you would increase the acceptance of refugees in society. And I think that is a very true approach and very valuable to follow. What is interesting about this initiative is it was in the context of the so-called Urban Innovative Action Initiative of the European Commission, an EU program, which was supposed to foster, well, yes, social innovation in cities at local level, also with the idea of upscaling it and transferring it to other countries in a European networks. But as far as I'm informed, that particular model did not really spread to other countries, which brings us back to what I said before, that it's extremely difficult, obviously, in the housing area to really transfer models to other contexts.
Thank you very much. Okay, I don't know if you would like to add something else, SprINg, on that, or if it's done, it's fine.
I'm fine, yeah, thanks.
Perfect. There are other questions, but we are a bit behind, and we should just move forward, not to end very late. So, anyways, thank you very much for attending this webinar, and we will publish the main takeaways together with this video in our platform in the upcoming weeks, as I said before. And to follow our upcoming events and publications, please follow us on Twitter or subscribe to our policy new flash email updates. So lastly, I would like to thank our distinguished panel for giving their precious time to share the insights with us during this very busy end of the year season. Please, we need holidays. And thank you all of the viewers, wherever you are, and thank you very much, and have a very lovely winter break.
Thank you very much.